this next section, we're going to be looking at chemistry of the atmosphere, and this is again part of your chemistry paper 2. Firstly, we need to be aware of the different gases that make up the Earth's atmosphere, and there are 3 main ones that we need to be able to discuss and give the percentages for. So the first one is nitrogen, otherwise known as N2, and this makes up around 80% of our atmosphere today. In comparison, oxygen makes up approximately 20% of the Earth's atmosphere. We also have trace amounts of carbon dioxide, water vapour and noble gases, which combine give small amounts and actually less than a percentage. Carbon dioxide is now around 0.04%. What we know is that, and this is using rock evidence, is that for the last 200 million years, the proportions of these different gases in the atmosphere have been very much the same as they are today. In more recent years, as in the last 150, we can start to see that CO2 levels have gone up. But for the most part, these percentages have been pretty stable for 200 million years. But that wasn't what the Earth's early atmosphere was actually like. And so we need to be prepared to talk about the Earth's early atmosphere, how it formed, and how it changed to what it is today. Now, we use models of what we can see happening on other planets, and the ideas around how this has happened has changed over time. And it's quite tricky to actually say for sure how this actually formed, because first of all, this happened a long time ago, like 4.6 billion years ago. There is no remaining evidence left behind because of the tectonic and geological activity on Earth, and there wasn't life there at the time to witness it. Now, the theory that we're going to follow is the suggestion that for the first billion years or so of the Earth's life, there was a lot of volcanic activity. Now, through investigating and studying gases of volcanoes today, using that as our starting point, we can then be pretty confident of the gases that were released. Now, with volcanic eruptions, we have a huge amount of water vapour released, some nitrogen, ammonia is also released, huge proportions of carbon dioxide and methane. This is what we see being released in volcanoes today, and so it's a fair assumption that this is what was released from volcanoes then. What we know, and we'll come back around to this in a little bit, is that nitrogen is relatively unreactive. And so although volcanoes are only releasing a little amount of nitrogen at a time, this is how over the years we've gone from very little nitrogen to 80%. Every time volcanoes erupted, it's just released a little bit more nitrogen into the air. And when it's got there, it's not really gone anywhere. Now, we think that was our Earth's early atmosphere, so a huge proportion of carbon dioxide and water vapour. But as the Earth began to cool, the water vapour left the Earth's atmosphere and condensed to form oceans. Now, a common question that comes up is you can be asked at what temperature our oceans started to form. And this is the idea that this is the point of condensation. So when the Earth cooled below 100 degrees, because at the very start of Earth's history it was hot, at that point the water then condensed, and that's what formed our oceans. What that would have meant is that now the Earth's early atmosphere would have been 90% or more carbon dioxide, so incredibly high. What then happened is that the carbon dioxide dissolved into the oceans. When CO2 dissolves into water, it actually forms carbonic acid, a weak one, but it forms an acid. That, we think over time, we can still model this now, is that the carbon dioxide dissolved into the oceans formed carbonates that then precipitated and made sediments at the bottom of the ocean, so started to form rocks. What this does mean is that a huge proportion of carbon dioxide in the Earth's early atmosphere is now today locked in rocks. So, two things have happened. Since the Earth's early atmosphere is formed, oxygen levels have gone from 0 to 20%. So in the Earth's early atmosphere, they'd be close to 0 or none, while today we're looking at 20%. Carbon dioxide is now looking at 90+%, while now it's down to trace amounts at 0.04%. So oxygen has gone massively up, carbon dioxide's gone massively down. So with oxygen, what we think or suspect is around 2.7 billion years ago, algae, these microscopic plant life, first arrived on Earth and they began photosynthesizing. And as soon as that happened, carbon dioxide, a reactant needed for photosynthesis, started getting removed from the Earth's atmosphere, but oxygen for the first time began to be produced. And over time, took around a billion years, other plants also evolved. So there wasn't enough oxygen at this time to support any animals, but plants were starting to change our atmosphere. They were adding more and more oxygen and removing some of the CO2. When oxygen levels then got high enough, that's when animals would have been able to evolve. The other thing that's important to note here is that this is explaining why oxygen's going up, but with this reaction, we're producing that glucose. The carbon was ending up getting locked in biomass that we'll look in a bit more detail in a moment. So for now, we do need to, although it's a biology equation, be aware, even for your chemistry, that in photosynthesis, it's carbon dioxide and water making glucose and oxygen. So as long as this was happening with photosynthetic organisms on Earth, we'd find that the proportion of oxygen increased. But also, carbon dioxide was decreasing. So here, it links back to we had the evolution of algae and plants. That photosynthesis removed carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, but it became locked in biomass. It also still continued to dissolve in oceans and become locked in rocks too. So the biomass happened in that the plant may have died and turned into fossil fuels. And so actually in this case, locked in biomass, the carbon has ended up in fuels buried underneath the earth. The carbon is also found in every living organism on Earth. It's worth mentioning that in terms of nitrogen, the proportion has gradually increased. So it's the idea here that it's relatively inert, that chemical processes such as volcanic eruptions are still putting it into the atmosphere, but that hasn't really been removed. So what this does mean is that it's just tended to accumulate over time. This starts then to lead into greenhouse gases. Now these are gases that contribute towards climate change, and we'll look at this in a bit more detail in a moment. Now examples of greenhouse gases include CO2, methane and also water vapour, but the ones that we're predominantly concerned around about CO2 and methane. Water vapour does not tend to stay in our atmosphere very long. This will condense and go into our water supply. So these are the concerning ones, because actually for CO2 in particular, it can stay in our air for hundreds of years. While this, the water vapour, may only stay around for a few days. These greenhouse gases contribute towards the greenhouse effect. Now, we do need some greenhouse gas in our atmosphere to maintain temperatures that are suitable for life on Earth. If we didn't have any greenhouse gases, Earth would be too cold for survival. The issue we've got though is that we now have too much greenhouse gases in our atmosphere, and it's warming the Earth up too much. Now it's this awkward thing where biology, chemistry and physics all start to overlap. When we look at this, the idea about greenhouse gases is they are trapping in energy that came from the sun. The idea is that solar energy comes in from the sun, moves through our atmosphere and strikes the Earth's surface. and temporarily the Earth's surface absorbs that radiation and re-emits it as infrared radiation. A majority of that should pass straight back out into space, but some gets absorbed by the particles of gas in the atmosphere, and that causes them to warm up. So the shorter wavelengths from the sun pass through atmosphere and are absorbed into the Earth. These are re-emitted as longer infrared radiation. And this is what gets absorbed by the greenhouse gases. And they actually redirect them back to the Earth's surface, keeping us warmer. Methane and carbon dioxide are caused by different human activities. Carbon dioxide is coming down to a combination of increased combustion, so a product of combustion is CO2, but also deforestation, so removal of plant life. By cutting down organisms that photosynthesize, we are reducing the amount of photosynthesis on Earth and therefore reducing how much carbon dioxide is removed. Methane is produced through waste, but also agriculture, so animals on Earth producing methane. Now, the idea about global warming is that the Earth's temperatures are increasing. And generally, for the most part, this is now pretty well accepted because the data that we've collected has now been peer-reviewed. Scientists have checked each other's work and are agreeing with the methodology that's gone around it. So this is really important. The science community need to be able to evaluate and critique each other's work. The purpose of that is to prevent false claims and people just making statements that aren't true. By doing this and having this process of peer review means that scientists and therefore the public can be more confident with how accurate and reliable that data is. However, the issue around global warming and climate change is a really complex issue, and it's very difficult to model, so we learn about it from a more simplified viewpoint. That means that actually it's led to uncertainty and people then making arguments that don't fully support the theory. With global warming itself though, this is when we see an average rise of the Earth's temperature on the Earth's surface, and this has consequences. If we have global warming and raising global temperatures, this can lead to global climate change, where our climate is then affected. The consequences of this can include polar ice caps melting. So what we'll find, and this kind of starts to link into the biology as well, is that organisms that live in these areas are going to lose their habitat. But sea levels will rise, and the issue we've got here is that we'll have flooding. But the land that gets flooded is flooded with salty water, and that is not particularly good for whatever plant life in particular or animals are using that water. So we're going to find these areas are flooded with salty water that make it very difficult for plants to live. And so in that, not only has it been flooded, but it's also been drenched in salt. So both of those things are going to have a devastating effect for habitats. The global climate change will also lead to more extreme weather experienced. So storms are going to become more frequent and more dangerous actually. There'll be more frequent cases of flooding, which is going to lead to destruction of habitats in turn. This can have biological consequences. Because weather climates have changed, we're going to find that migration patterns of animals will be affected. Birds may migrate later, if at all. And that's going to affect food chains, but more of a biological aspect for that one. With this, it's putting organisms at pressure. So we've got a risk of extinction because habitats are starting to change, and that pretty much we see worldwide. So it's thought that by 2050, about 30% of plants and animals on Earth will be at risk, not extinct, but a risk of extinction. Turtles, for example, are one kind of big example. They're losing their nesting sites because sea levels are rising, but also because their eggs are incubated at warmer temperatures. Their gender is determined by the temperature at which eggs are incubated at. So all the eggs currently being hatched for turtles are predominantly female. The males will be at lower temperatures, and Well, they're not at low temperatures, they're warmer. So warmer sand is causing more turtles to be born as females, while the colder sand will be causing males to be born. But because it's warmer, they're all coming up female. Also, we can have changes to rainfall. So generally the rule here is that areas that tend to be wet will get wetter, while areas that were dry will become drier. In both of these, though, we're going to end up with a destruction of habitat. The wetter can't deal with more water necessarily, and drier, we're going to get drought. So actually the areas of some of our deserts is increasing. So around our coastline is flooding and our deserts are getting larger. Seawater will also expand. So flooding and rising sea levels are not just down to the melting ice caps, but down to the fact that when water is warmed up, the particles move away from each other and get larger. So it means that the warmer water actually brings up or takes up a larger volume or a bigger space. So seawater will rise in turn, and that again causes more flooding. Carbon dioxide in particular is a cause for concern. And so one crucial thing that comes into the curriculum is this idea about carbon footprint. Now, this is the total amount of carbon dioxide, but also other greenhouse gases like methane, that are emitted over the full life cycle of maybe a product, a service, or even an event. If we want to reduce our carbon footprint, we need to reduce CO2 and methane emissions. So individual things that we can do is using like solar panels to produce electricity, reducing our use of fossil fuels, using a bicycle instead of a car to travel, reducing the flights that we take, but also improving our home installation. Be prepared, you might be given in an exam some questions around changes that could be made, or maybe interpreting a life cycle assessment that starts to fit into a carbon footprint. We need to also be aware of atmospheric pollutants. The crucial things is how they form and the problems that they cause. Now, for the most part, combustion of fuels is where these atmospheric pollutants are coming from. So generally, for the most part, the fuels that we burn, such as coal or oil, will contain a huge proportion of carbon, some hydrogen, but they will also sometimes be contaminated with a bit of sulfur, and that has consequences. So when we burn a fuel, we can make carbon dioxide, water vapor, oxides of nitrogen, and we'll look at why this happens in a moment. But we can also make sulfur dioxide, carbon monoxide, and soot, otherwise known as solid particles. We need to be able to describe how each of these form and the problems that they cause. So, carbon dioxide is when we have complete combustion of fuels, so burning has happened with enough oxygen. But carbon monoxide and carbon particulates are made when we have a lack of oxygen during combustion. With sulfur dioxide, this forms when we burn a fuel that has been contaminated with sulfur, while the oxides of nitrogen are made when the conditions are hot. We've looked at earlier on that 20% of the air is oxygen and 80% of the air is nitrogen. Now, typically at room temperature, they're colliding, but not with enough energy to actually react. If we end up in an area of combustion, like a car engine, where it's really, really hot, pressure's really high, because air is also in there, that means we have nitrogen and oxygen in there too. And because now they're in a condition where it's really hot and high pressure, those two gases that are just found in the air start to react and form these oxides of nitrogen. These cause problems. Now, carbon dioxide, as we've seen, causes global warming. Carbon monoxide is toxic. It's odorless, it's colourless, but what it does is it binds to our hemoglobin in our red blood cells and reduces how much oxygen can be transported in our blood. So if we suffer from carbon monoxide poisoning, in severe cases, this can cause death. And you won't know it's happening because it's colourless and odourless. So we can't see it and we can't smell it. Carbon particulates cause both health problems and environmental issues. So first of all, carbon particulates like soot can cause respiratory problems, and it can aggravate asthma. It also causes this issue of global dimming. This is where, with soot suspended in the air, it absorbs sunlight and reduces the amount of light getting down onto the Earth's surface. Sulfur dioxide and oxides of nitrogen actually cause very similar problems. They both have the ability to dissolve into water and form acid rain, which in turn is going to lower the pH of that water, which can damage plants and invertebrates that are living there, and it can also damage buildings. Also, on top of that, sulfur dioxide and oxides of nitrogen can cause respiratory problems, so they're going to make the symptoms of asthma worse.